Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, where geopolitics and insurance meet. This is a special episode produced in association with Gallagher Specialty. Our topic is Kidnap and Ransom, global hotspots and conditions for K&R to thrive. I'm your host, David Benyon. My guests are Eddie Kurshumlija, Director of Crisis Management, Product Recall, Kidnap, Ransom, Extortion at Gallagher Specialty, and Adam Carrier, Head of Consulting at AnotherDay, a Gallagher company. This is a great opportunity to discuss kidnap and ransom insurance, an exciting but perhaps little understood line of insurance business. And to guide us through it, we have two great subject matter experts, one a leading broker and the other a senior leading crisis management consultant. They're both well placed to explain how this type of insurance functions, including working with the response consultants and sources of intelligence vital to K&R, together with clients and other entities that make this such a fascinating corner of the insurance world. We get into the details of what is typically included, what might be added on, and what would be excluded. We discuss some emerging hotspots for K&R, its different forms, as well as assessing the characteristics that tend to allow such criminality to proliferate. As this is the Political Risk Podcast, it's perhaps not a surprise that some of the territories where K&R is rife are going to be geopolitical hotspots, places where the rule of law is weak or is broken down almost entirely, allowing chaos, unrest, instability and criminality to proliferate. There's a lot to unpackage, so let's get straight into it. Enjoy the episode. Eddie and Adam, welcome to the pod.
Thank you.
Welcome for the first time in your case.
First time for me, yeah.
And welcome back, Adam.
I know, I've just nodded at you as if everyone could see.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it's good to be back.
Yes, indeed it is. So, Eddie, you lead K&R at Gallagher. So for a layperson who doesn't work in the K&R space, I certainly don't, would you provide a bit of an overview of what the product's designed to do and how, in your role, Gallagher's practice supports it?
In layman's terms, a K&R policy is an insurance product that helps to protect individuals and businesses against the financial and emotional impact against sort of situations such as kidnaps, extortions, detentions and hijacks. These are very real threats, particularly for people that are working and travelling to high-risk territories. I'd say the typical buyers are sort of multinational organisations, high net worth individuals, schools and any charity sort of operating in maybe unstable territories. The way that I help is I'm a placement broker, so I would look to place a policy with the right insurer. What we tend to specialise on is ensuring that the policy is designed correctly by looking through the client's exposures, their operations, and then tailoring and designing a product to fit those risks and exposures.
So Adam, turning to you, in your role as Head of Consulting at AnotherDay, how are you involved in K&R?
So predominantly from a support perspective, both on the client side to the people that Eddie works with, but then also previously provided intelligence support for response consultants dealing with kidnap cases, just to provide them essentially with the bench strength that they need if they take a new case on, to make sure we've got analysts on standby to generate intelligence around that specific case, whether that's doing that remotely or engaging with human intelligence sources that might be able to support the initial kind of situation assessment that the response consultants will do. On the client side, often we're working with clients to help them build out or prepare their kind of crisis management frameworks internally. And there's often a perspective, and this kind of cuts across all different types of insurance, but I think there's a level of naivety or kind of ignorance around K&R because it's not used very often, thank God, that there's just, well, we just pull the pin on the insurance policy and then everything else kind of takes care of itself. But actually, the response consultants need information and they need to be brought in at the right time by the right people. There needs to be a crisis management team in the organisation stood up so that the response consultants have got people that they can engage with. And so from our side, it's very much about making sure the client's crisis management plans are ready to go in those very highly stressful and emotionally charged situations where they could have a colleague, for example, who's gone missing or has been confirmed abducted, etc. Because the insurance is one side of it, but there's actually a whole organisational response that's needed as well.
I think, as Adam touched on it, the consultancy piece is actually one of the key reasons why clients tend to buy the coverage. You've got these guys who specialize in these type of situations. They usually come with extensive backgrounds in the military or in kind of intelligence agencies. So, they're on the ground to basically manage the situation and also the strategy, and they can at times be the difference between life and death.
I'm conscious that when we've talked previously, Adam, for example, we talk about political violence, and it's a very different product. But also, there must be some overlap in terms of the services, the kind of information analytics that you're providing between the two.
Yeah, definitely, because political violence is a kind of catch-all term for an insurance policy that covers everything from war and interstate conflict down to sabotage of assets, physical assets by state-level actors, but also includes civil unrest and things of that nature, which by the kind of fluid dynamics of those kinds of threat introduce potentially some kidnap and ransom risk for clients as well. And so what we try to do with the Gallagher client base, at least, is take a kind of consulting-led approach where if you're approaching the crisis management team because you think you need some K&R insurance, for example, because you've got men and women operating in Nigeria, or actually, what have you done to kind of assess your overall risk environment in that country? Because yes, K&R is important, but there's also political violence risks, there's terrorism risks, there's all of this other stuff as well that you need to be thinking about. And so the insurance is one element of the solution, but there's a lot of risk management work that organizations can do to stop themselves being targeted in the first place. And if they are targeted, to prevent those successful K&R attempts, for example. So in the insurance industry, we tend to think in terms of product lines, but on the client side, they think in terms of risk management and risk transfer. And so for us, it's really about using consulting to say, here's all of the risks that you've got operating in this country. Here's the insurance products that will help you to transfer some of that risk. But then also, here's the wider recommendations around risk management that they sit within. So rather than just kind of off-the-shelf products, as it were.
I mean, this is a geopolitics podcast, really, albeit primarily for insurance markets. But certainly if you're not within the insurance world, crisis management is a good catch-all term. But the kind of operating environments we're talking about are ones which, for example, there's more than civil unrest, perhaps complete breakdown of law and order. So it's jurisdictions that have that level of instability, that kind of breakdown.
Definitely, yeah.
Well, it could be a geopolitical context. It almost certainly is. But what we're talking about is the kind of criminality element rather than political or terrorism, which is a different insurance product, but certainly operates in that same context.
Completely agree. Actually, we pulled some data from some of the databases that we got ahead of this podcast. And to your point there, it probably comes as no surprise, but the leading countries, at least from an abduction and forced disappearance perspective, Syria, Nigeria, Myanmar, and Haiti. And, 3 out of those 4 are all in the middle of very significant internal unrest, civil unrest, transitions of government. Whenever we see that, then the risk of kidnap, both for ransom but also for political and ideological reasons, necessarily increases, as does all other kind of political violence perils predominantly.
Well, let's get into some of the kind of definitional aspects to this, because I think it is helpful, insurance being the way it is, to try and distinguish what's included and what's excluded. So, Eddie, let's go back to you as a broker here. So, firstly, what tends to be covered, and what are some of the kind of typical add-ons that buyers tend to want to broaden out the basics of K&R protection?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that there are 4 core insured events that you would associate with any sort of kidnap and ransom policy. And I mentioned them earlier, and that's kidnap, extortion, wrongful detention, and hijack. Now, once the policy is triggered, the type of costs that are covered would be consultancy costs, which are unlimited, ransom payments, any ransom payments that are paid are covered under the policy. Any additional expenses, and this is a very broad term. I mean, it includes anything from sort of travel and accommodation costs to covering employee salary, any reward that's paid out for information, even something like personal financial loss. So if the insured person, the victim, has had to pay a mortgage or a loan repayment in that time, any public relations that are undertaken by the company during this event, and then obviously any psychiatric help or medical expenses. And there's a long list of other expenses that are included. I could be here all day to kind of mention them. But then you're also covered for something called legal liability. So this would be any claim that's made by an insured person, so a staff member of the company, against the company. So they may turn around and say, XYZ Limited, we feel you didn't give us the right duty of care. Therefore, we are taking you to court over this. Some of the legal costs involved in defending yourself against those claims are also covered under the policy. And then finally, you're also covered for any kind of personal accident, so any death or disability arising from a covered event. Now, you mentioned a good point there, Dave, about the extensions that have been added on over time. So kidnap and ransom policies have evolved over the years. So they're now starting to include additional triggers, such as threats. So any threat made to your people or to your property that doesn't have any financial ransom aligned to it. Covered for any disappearance. So if you haven't heard from someone within sort of 48 hours, you feel that's unusual, you can open the policy up for the consultants to carry out an investigation. Express kidnap. So this is in a kind of shorter term abductions where the ransom is paid directly by the victim themselves. So if someone was to hold someone at knife point, gunpoint, take them to an ATM or multiple ATMs.
Yeah, we see this in movies sometimes.
Exactly. Political evacuations. So if there are non-nationals in a certain part of the world where the security situation has started to deteriorate to the point where it actually becomes a potential threat to them, then it opens the policy up to facilitate an evacuation from that territory. Other extensions that we typically see clients buy is something like a hostage event. So very similar to a detention, a hostage event. The reason for a hostage extension, I would say, is there's a greater threat to life. So all it does is accelerate the waiting period from the detention trigger from 4 hours to 1 hour. And then you've got something like assault expense, whereby there is assault using a lethal weapon on one of your staff. Then it opens the policy up for the consultants to carry out an initial assessment, any kind of personal accident that arises from it, and any additional expenses as well. Those are the main extensions, I would say, that clients tend to purchase.
We've talked about what is included in the policy and what can be added onto it. So let's spend a minute just talk about some of the boundaries where that would stray into, for example, things that would not be covered by K&R.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I think this is quite an interesting point because there is a misconception that the policy might not cover any territories where the FCDO advise against travel. That's absolutely not the case. It is there for those high-risk territories. However, where the boundary is when we're dealing with a sanctioned territory or a sanctioned person or a sanctioned group. Gallagher cannot facilitate any placement involving a sanctioned group, sanctioned person, or involving the sanctioned territory.
Right. And that includes prescribed terrorist organisations.
That's correct, yes. In those events, it's usually the government would step in and handle it from there.
Does this sometimes lead to some grey areas, some misconceptions? You already mentioned one about travel advice, for instance, about what can be covered, with maybe one or two useful historical examples if you've got one or two in your back pocket. I'm thinking things like, do you know, or family members, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the misconceptions is that the policy will only cover directors, officers, and employees. But actually what I'd say clients are pleasantly surprised to learn is that the policy does also extend to family members as well. And it's not just business travel that it covers, it also covers personal travel. So we typically see people like to go on exotic holidays to some sort of high-risk territories, potentially. And any event that does occur there, any insured event that does occur there, the policy can respond to those. Thankfully, we haven't had too many situations whereby a client's family member has been subject to an event like that. We have had one or two cases whereby they have traveled to places like Mexico and have encountered a few situations there and a few threats, and the policy has responded in terms of consultancy advice. But thankfully, not too many of those.
So Adam, what are some of the underlying factors as you see them that influence a rise or a decline within that K&R risk profile that you alluded to earlier for certain territories when conditions become ripe for this type of criminality?
Yeah, I mean, if you had a Venn diagram, the two elements that would be closest together would be a very weakened rule of law, whether that's corruption within the government and the law system, law enforcement, etc. And then also commensurately with that, an increase in the capabilities of organised crime and an inability of law enforcement to deal with that. But then the other element of that Venn diagram would be some kind of social collapse, whether that's civil war, civil unrest, etc., that just provides real fertile ground because more people are more exposed to violence in general. And abduction is a core element of many different groups in terms of how they exert control over populations, how they exert control over NGOs, journalism, the media, etc., but also foreign nationals. So there's a kind of heady mix of the security conditions on the ground, but then also the profile of the individuals. I mean, Eddie spoke about Mexico a second ago, and having spent quite a lot of time out there and a lot of time talking with some really experienced local response consultants, really the risk profile in places like Mexico is very much affluent local business people or individuals that hold some level of wealth that are local. And it's predominantly criminal groups in Mexico as opposed to the cartels that are involved in that kind of kidnap for ransom activity. And really, the reason that they're targeting those locals is that for the express kidnap reasons we spoke about earlier, you can chuck someone in the back of the car and drive them around some ATMs locally, get them to draw as much cash out as you can, get them calling all of their family members and getting them to, meet you on the street with cash, etc., and then kick someone loose. And within 24 hours, you could have made, $15,000, $20,000, $25,000. And the risk profile is so much lower because, you're not taking someone for a lot of days. They're much less likely to get an effective response from law enforcement. They don't tend to focus on foreign nationals in Mexico. And for the cartels, these are billion-dollar organizations. It's just not worth the risk versus reward for them to kind of turn it into a business because they're making enough money doing other stuff, basically. But there are other areas where being a foreign national of certain nationalities can increase your risk profile. Certain places in Africa, for example, we see that quite a lot where there is foreign investment, foreign infrastructure being built in the energy sector, for example. If you've got companies that have, let's say, ineffective engagement with local communities, that can create a level of anger in the local community that then translates into individuals being taken for ransom in order to try and extract some money out of those foreign companies that are operating in those locations, but not spreading the wealth into those local communities and building those local communities up.
We talked about the importance of this in a previous episode when we were talking about energy projects that do the right things on the ground in those sorts of territories versus those that don't, being a bit more of a...
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it sounds really silly, but we always say that the best security measure is being nice because you tend to generate a lot less threats if you treat people fairly and with respect and you understand that you are integrating into a local environment of human terrain that you might not be 100% cognizant of when you first move in there. And so mapping that and understanding the local community and understanding their concerns, you can mitigate a significant amount of security risk to your people, to your assets, and that includes kidnap and ransom. So the profile of the individuals is very much a key factor as well as the security environment.
So you already cited a few territories, and you're going to have to give them again because my memory's not that good. But go into them in a little bit more depth. So why in each case? I think you mentioned at least 3 or 4. Yeah,
so Syria is a really good example. So the data we've got goes from June 2022 to literally June this year. And it's because there is no rule of law. You've got multiple elements of that country that are under the control of different armed groups. And often those armed groups are employing and using young men with weapons that don't get paid a lot of money and are told to extract taxes or whatever it might be through illegal vehicle checkpoints, etc. And so detaining someone and shaking them down for more money is a quick and easy way for those groups, those individuals, to earn a little bit of pocket money, basically, because there is no law of armed conflict or military discipline as we would understand it in those groups. And certainly if you're having to transit between those zones of control, again, your profile may lead to an increase in risk. So if you're a journalist, for example, what religion are you? Or what sect of what religion are you? These are the kinds of unpredictable elements that when you've got a lot of hopped up young men with weapons that are potentially not making good decisions in the best of situations, that's when you start to see this increase in volume of these abductions for sure. Nigeria is a little bit of a different example. There's much more of a, business model around kidnap and ransom, what we see. In fact, we were speaking to a very highly experienced response consultant that cut his teeth in Latin America and did a 6-month secondment in Nigeria with another response consultant to just get a feel for how it's different in different jurisdictions. And they had a case while he was there where there was 2 Chinese nationals that were kidnapped. And it was all done over WhatsApp through a local mediator who happened to be a government official of one of the states in which the kidnapping took place. And the response consultant was very matter-of-fact over these communications with WhatsApp with the kidnap gang that were basically asking for a certain amount of money for all these Chinese nationals. And the response consultant was, you know that the going rate for a Chinese national is X, not Y. Stop messing us around. We can have this much cash to you by tomorrow, and then let's leave it at that. And they kind of agreed with that, and off they went. Whereas this response consultant that spent most of his time working in Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, was absolutely horrified because the level of violence involved in the kidnap cases in Latin America is a lot higher. And so there's much more of a careful engagement required with the kidnappers in order to mitigate any direct physical safety risks to the individual that's been kidnapped, which wasn't necessarily the case, at least in this instance, where that he'd seen when he was in West Africa. So, yeah, really interesting to see from those kind of first-hand accounts just how different the engagements can be and how much it's a business model in some areas. In others, it's about the power dynamics of being able to extract that money. And, you know, it obviously, all areas where this risk is high fit somewhere along that spectrum, really. And then also there's the ideological component as well, of course, which we see a lot in different countries, whether it's, you know, be kidnapped for religious reasons, whether it's for political reasons, etc., in order to raise the profile of certain groups, something that we have seen in the Middle East for the last 25 years.
Using the example that Adam just gave of a criminal group a kidnapping in Nigeria, for instance, at the point at which it's freshly happened, it's a kidnap. How would you know, for example, how does this work in practice, assuming you don't know very much about the organisation or the group that's done the kidnapping, whether they are, for example, purely a criminal organisation or whether they have some political affiliation and whether they, as a consequence of that, they could be on a sanctions list?
This is a key reason as to why the consultants are so important and having access to them, because they have on-the-ground intelligence whereby they will understand which criminal group is involved, what the going rate is, as Adam mentioned, to ensure that the secure release. And we do sometimes come up against this because obviously some criminal organizations will feel there's more value masquerading as a terrorist group because they think that might create panic and cause people to pay the full amount demanded. But actually having these consultants who understand the area, they understand the intricacies, the nuances, they'll be able to identify whether or not it is in fact a terrorist group or whether it's just a criminal group that's kidnapped the person.
We've talked already about some factors that might improve the risk profile. And in the US, for instance, there's new legislation against workplace violence incidents. So, yeah, what kind of impact is that having?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've spoken a lot about high-risk jurisdictions that people would probably expect to come up in this kind of discussion. But companies are probably much less aware of the fact that workplace violence incidents in general in the West are on the rise. And so necessarily governments are taking steps to mitigate that. In the US, for example, there's multiple states that are implementing workplace violence protections for employees of companies. And so there's a duty of care now on companies to protect their employees from violence. And so, you know, there's a lot of companies out there that probably wouldn't consider a K&R policy because they don't have international travellers. But to Eddie's point earlier, and you might be able to expand on this, Eddie, this could actually provide them with some coverage and some risk management, etc., to fulfil that duty of care.
Yeah, exactly, Adam. And that's a good point. I mean, people typically think this is just aimed for people that are traveling to those high-risk territories. Actually, if you're a US company or you have a US subsidiary or you have offices there, the incident can even happen locally. And to have this policy, as Adam mentioned, it shows that you've kind of ticked that box to say that you have got that duty of care to your employees, that you do have a policy in place which provides you rapid response, consultancy response for any sort of workplace violence incidents taking place. So it's another advantage of having the product.
Okay, so for our last big question, really, it's about blurring of lines between corporate and political. So, Adam, let's start with you. For Western firms, it does seem there is a blurring of lines between corporate and political these days. How is this manifesting itself? For example, in detentions, we've talked previously and you referenced an example of an event that took place in Belarus, and then theoretically how you might relate that to something outside of the Western world?
There's always been a political dimension to kidnap and ransom risk. That necessarily isn't a novel idea. It's just that we live in a very globalized world where there has been, over the last 30, 40 years, a lot of foreign direct investment from Western companies, Western non-governmental organizations, charities, etc., in other areas of the world in a time when there was less state-on-state competition. Now we have moved into a very different world where there is a lot of state-on-state competition. And so necessarily your nationals in those countries are sometimes vulnerable to detention in order to coerce or exert pressure on other governments. And we've seen that with actors like Iran, for example, detaining people that are accused of being spies when they might just be tourists. That can happen quite frequently. And I think that large Western corporations that are operating in areas that sit on the other side of the geopolitical aisle, let's say, again, can be exposed in order to target them just because they come from that nation. So we had an incident just a few years ago now. It's a US medical equipment company operating out of Belarus, and their US expat personnel within the office were targeted by the Belarusian KGB for detention. They bugged the offices. They were essentially putting a lot of pressure and influence on them, making threats to those individuals. And it wasn't necessarily because of anything the company had done. It was very much they're a very well-known large US corporation operating in that country. And so that increased their risk profile. And it's not kidnap for ransom in the traditional criminality or ideological ways that we would perceive that. So it's definitely something that will probably increase in those countries where we are seeing competition between two nation states, as it were, I would say. What are you seeing from the client side, Eddie, do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Adam. I mean, the boundary, like you say, is becoming increasingly blurred. It's now elevated the risk for Western companies beyond that of a criminal threat and into the realms of, state retaliation and diplomatic gamesmanship. So something like detention maybe before wasn't as big of a risk as it is now, just because of the sort of geopolitical landscape and the sort of tit for tat we're seeing between two different nations. But the KNR policy is there obviously to cover situations such as wrongful detentions. It's there to offer support services for evacuation if the security situation deteriorates and there is a threat to any Westerners in certain territories, and therefore, to carry out sort of threat assessments and also any crisis planning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this isn't necessarily related just to KNR, but we provide intelligence services for a number of direct clients. And recently we've been asked more and more for guidance around how to educate their business travelers about their political views online, their social media presence, etc., before they travel to places, because it can increase that traveler's risk of detention, because border security is getting much more sophisticated, much more connected. And so your online presence is an extension of you as an individual. And so you can put out a lot of risk signal online that you might not be aware of. And obviously that's a very sensitive line to tread, because as a company, you can't necessarily tell your employees what they should and shouldn't post online outside of business hours, but it can increase their risk profile. And so how do you educate them about those risks and help them make more informed decisions so they don't end up being detained when they travel?
And that's all for another special episode of the Political Risk Podcast. I hope that was as insightful a conversation for you as it was for me. Thank you for listening, and please do keep tuning in. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my two superb guests for this episode, Adam Carrier and Eddie Kurshumlija. Production was by Peter McGill, and my cousin Lawrence Durkin made the music.